An allowance, you say that we should provide an untethered allowance, but one that is structured. So I like to find out what you mean. Can you elaborate on how you think a parent should set up and use an allowance? And maybe even tell us how you're doing that with your kids.
Yeah, definitely. And so the thing when it comes to advice around children, and so I spent, you didn't know this, John, but I spent about 20 years as a child and adolescent psychologist, as I was sort of as a part-time job. And so I've worked with hundreds and hundreds, actually thousands of families and children. And the bottom line is that general advice, you always have to take it with a grain of salt, because essentially you have a unique human being that you're in charge of and that you're trying to nurture and develop. And so any advice you hear might be totally ineffective with your child. And I think when I finally became a parent, I really realized how ridiculous this generalized advice is, because every child's different and they respond differently. And so I'll start with that. But I did notice working with a lot of adolescents, when allowance gets attached to chores. So for example, then your child, maybe when they're 14 and they become a little bit oppositional, they might be like, well, I don't want to do my chores, so you don't have to pay me any money. And I've seen a lot of parents go, oh my goodness, that's not what I wanted. I wasn't wanting them to bow out because they don't need the money, and now they're not doing their chores. And so not to say that that's going to happen for all children, but if you see that happening, it's time to adjust your approach. And the other thing that I heard parents complain a lot about is that they give their child an allowance and they mismanage it. And they spend it impulsively, and then it's all gone within a day or two. And parents would sit back and just sort of wonder, what's wrong with my child that this is happening? And I always sort of framed it as, well, your child is just behaving the way that any child would, without strings attached to the money. I mean, so part of it that I have in my mind is like, what are the values I want to teach my children? What is it I want them to teach around? What do I want to teach them around money, how to look at money, how to handle money? And so when I approach allowance with my 7-year-old, we're not doing it yet with my 3-year-old, that's what I was thinking. And so my wife and I sat down, we thought about it. It's important that they get to spend. Let me just start with there. It's important that you learn how to spend money, that you get some satisfaction in spending money, that you can enjoy money. I mean, this is part of what we need to do. It's also important to save. It's also important to invest. And for us, it's also important to give. And so we have 4 jars for our son. And so we've divided the allowance up into dollar bills so we can actually have the physical experience of putting them in the jars. And then we talk about all 4 of those areas. And so I wouldn't say those areas need to be for everybody, but that's how we've structured it for my kids.